The prophecy awakens. The Codex of Eternal Warning sat in the great archive of Velcara Prime, untouched for 3,000 cycles. Its crystalline pages held prophecies written by civilizations so ancient that even their ruins had turned to cosmic dust. The Galactic Council rarely consulted it anymore. Most prophecies had either come true or been dismissed as metaphorical warnings from paranoid ancestors who feared the unknown. But when humanity invented faster-than-light travel in the year 2247, everything changed. The detection happened during a routine council session. Ambassador Thren of the Velcari race was presenting a tedious report on trade route optimization when the archive's warning systems activated. A deep, resonant tone echoed through the chamber, a sound that hadn't been heard in living memory. The holographic displays flickered and died. In their place, ancient script materialized in the air, glowing with an eerie blue light that made even the oldest council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. High Chancellor Morvex, a being whose species had guided the council for 2 millennia, stood slowly. His 6 eyes widened as he read the words that appeared before them. His translator device struggled to convert the ancient language, but the meaning was clear enough to freeze the blood of every diplomat present. The prophecy spoke of a young species, chaotic, violent, born from a world of endless conflict where survival meant destroying competitors. It described beings who would reach the stars not through patience and wisdom, but through desperation and fury. When this species achieved faster-than-light capability, the prophecy warned they would spread across the galaxy like a plague. They would bring with them the same destructive nature that had defined their homeworld. Civilizations would fall. Order would collapse. The great peace that had lasted for 10,000 years would shatter like glass under a hammer. The final line sent a chill through the council chamber. It read simply, "And so the Fire Children shall unmake what the ancients built, and the galaxy shall know darkness once more." Within hours, every intelligence network in known space was redirected toward one target: Earth, the human homeworld. The analysts worked frantically, compiling everything they knew about this species that had just announced its arrival on the galactic stage. What they found seemed to confirm their worst fears. Humans had spent their entire recorded history at war. Their planet was divided into competing nations that fought over resources, territory, ideologies, and sometimes for reasons so trivial they defied rational understanding. They had created weapons capable of sterilizing their own world multiple times over. Their entertainment glorified violence. Their literature was filled with stories of conquest and domination. Even their children played games that simulated combat and destruction. The evidence seemed overwhelming. The psychological profiles were damning. Humans were aggressive, territorial, and prone to solving problems through force. They formed tribal groups and viewed outsiders with suspicion. Their first instinct when encountering something unknown was often to destroy it or dominate it. They were exactly what the prophecy had warned about. High Chancellor Morvex called an emergency session. The debate lasted for 3 planetary rotations. Some council members argued for immediate military action, quarantine at minimum, preemptive strikes at maximum. Others suggested diplomatic containment, surrounding human space with monitoring stations and preventing their expansion. A few voices called for patience and observation, but they were shouted down by those who had read the full prophecy and understood what was at stake. In the end, they chose a middle path. Humanity would be watched. Every ship that left their solar system would be tracked. Every communication monitored. Every transaction analyzed. The Council would not strike first, but they would be ready. The galaxy's vast defense networks, dormant for millennia, were quietly activated. Ancient weapons platforms that orbited dead stars powered up for the first time in ages. Battle fleets that existed only for ceremonial purposes began combat drills. The irony was lost on the Council members. In their fear of humanity's violent nature, they were preparing for war. Ambassador Thren was assigned to lead the observation effort. She established a network of stealth satellites around Earth's solar system and began compiling reports. What she saw in those first months seemed to validate every concern. Human ships pushed aggressively into nearby star systems. They established colonies with military efficiency. Their explorers carried weapons even on peaceful survey missions. When they encountered minor obstacles, they simply blasted through them, rather than finding elegant solutions. But Thran was a good observer. She didn't just watch what humans did, she tried to understand why they did it. She studied their history with a depth that few others bothered to attempt. She read their literature. Not just the violent parts, but the other stories too. The ones about sacrifice and compassion. The ones about people giving everything to save strangers. The ones about choosing mercy when vengeance would have been easier. She watched as human colony ships carried not just soldiers and miners, but artists and teachers and musicians. She saw them rescue crews risk their lives to save a single member trapped in a collapsed tunnel. She observed them form friendships with the few alien species brave enough to make contact, sharing food and stories despite having no common language. Something didn't fit. The prophecy spoke of destroyers, of fire children who would unmake the galaxy. But what Thran saw was more complicated. Yes, humans were capable of terrible violence, but they were also capable of remarkable kindness. They fought viciously to protect those they loved. They mourned their dead with genuine grief. They created beauty even in the harshest environments. She began filing minority reports, cautious observations that perhaps the prophecy was being misinterpreted. Perhaps the fire it spoke of wasn't destruction but transformation. Perhaps unmaking didn't mean destroying but rebuilding. Her reports were ignored. The Council had made up its mind. Humanity was the prophesied threat, and they would be ready when the humans finally showed their true nature. They didn't have to wait long. In 2251, just 4 years after humanity reached the stars, the crisis they had been dreading finally arrived. The test of fire, the distress signal, came from the Karathi system, a densely populated sector near the galactic core. 3 billion souls lived on Karathi Prime and its orbital habitats. They were a peaceful species, known throughout the galaxy for their philosophical traditions and breathtaking art. They had contributed more to galactic culture than to its economy or military, and everyone considered them harmless. The Devourers didn't care about philosophy or art. No one knew where the Devourers came from originally. They appeared every few centuries, emerging from the dark spaces between spiral arms like locusts from a dormant ground. They were a machine intelligence, ancient and relentless, programmed by some long-dead civilization to consume and convert matter into more of themselves. When they found a target, they stripped it bare. Planets became metal skeletons. Stars were drained of fuel. Nothing organic survived their harvest. The Karathi had perhaps 6 days before their world would be gone. The Galactic Council convened immediately. The debate was fierce but ultimately futile. The nearest council fleet was 3 weeks away. The Devourers had chosen their moment perfectly, striking when defensive forces were spread thin across the galaxy. Mathematical models were run and rerun. Every simulation ended the same way. The Karathi were doomed. High Chancellor Morvex stood before the assembled representatives, his ancient voice heavy with grief. They would send what ships they could. They would evacuate as many Karathi as possible, but they could not save the homeworld. 3 billion people would be reduced to perhaps a few million refugees. It was a tragedy, but it was mathematics. Cold, unavoidable mathematics. That's when the human transmission arrived. The human captain who appeared on their screens was young by any standard. She couldn't have been more than 30 cycles old. Her name was Sarah Chen, commander of the UHSV Indomitable, a heavy cruiser that had been conducting survey operations 2 systems away from Karathi space. She spoke quickly, her words translated through the Council's linguistic processors with only slight delay. "We've received the Karathi distress call," Captain Chen said. "We're the closest ship with significant combat capability. Request permission to engage the Devourers and buy time for evacuation." The Council chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. Ambassador Thran felt her heart skip a beat. This was it. This was the moment the prophecy had warned about. The Fire Children were about to reveal their true nature. High Chancellor Morvex composed himself quickly. "Captain Chen, we appreciate your concern, but you don't understand what you're facing. The Devourers have destroyed civilizations far more advanced than yours. Your ship, while impressive for its age, is no match for their swarm. We cannot authorize a suicide mission." Captain Chen smiled, and there was something in that expression that made Thren's skin prickle. It wasn't the smile of someone accepting defeat. It was the smile of someone who had already made up their mind and was just being polite about informing everyone else. "With respect, Chancellor, I'm not asking for authorization," Chen said. I'm informing you of our intentions as a courtesy. The Karathi sent out a distress call. We heard it. We're answering it. That's what humans do. The transmission ended before anyone could respond. Thren immediately pulled up the tactical feed from her monitoring satellites. The Indomitable was already accelerating toward Karathi space, pushing its engines far beyond recommended safety limits. 6 other human ships had changed course to follow it. None of them were military vessels. 2 were mining ships, heavy and slow but equipped with powerful industrial cutting lasers. 3 were colony transports, lightly armed and designed for carrying civilians not fighting wars. The last was a scientific research vessel that had no weapons at all. They were sailing toward certain death, and they knew it. The Council watched in stunned silence as the small human fleet entered Karathi space. The Devourer swarm was already visible on long-range sensors, a churning mass of millions of autonomous units that moved with hideous coordination. They had begun their harvest on the outer planets, stripping away atmosphere and crust with methodical efficiency. The Indomitable opened fire first. Its weapons were primitive compared to Council technology, still relying on accelerated projectiles and nuclear warheads rather than elegant energy systems. But there was nothing elegant about the fury with which they struck. The lead Devourer units disintegrated under the barrage. Hundreds died in the first minutes, but thousands more flowed forward to take their place. The mining ships positioned themselves in a defensive formation around Karathi Prime's orbital habitats, their cutting lasers designed to slice through asteroids, carved burning lines through the Devourer swarm. The colony transports deployed every drone and shuttle they had, creating a screen of small craft that harassed the enemy with everything from mining charges to improvised explosives. The research vessel did something unexpected. It began broadcasting across all frequencies, transmitting every piece of data it had on Devourer behavior patterns, structural weaknesses, and tactical tendencies. The transmission was meant for any ship within range that might use it. It was information freely given in the middle of battle, with no thought of keeping strategic advantages secret. Thren watched as the human ships were slowly overwhelmed. The Devourers adapted quickly, learning from each exchange. The mining ships lost their forward sections to precise strikes. The colony transports had their engines crippled. The research vessel took catastrophic damage and began evacuating its crew in escape pods. The Indomitable fought on alone, surrounded by an ocean of hostile machines. Its hull was breached in a dozen places. Life support was failing, but Captain Chen kept firing, kept maneuvering, kept buying seconds that stretched into minutes. Those minutes mattered. The Karathi used the time to evacuate their orbital habitats. Millions of civilians packed into every available transport, fleeing toward the outer system where Council rescue ships were finally beginning to arrive. The human ships had bought them perhaps an hour. In that hour, the projected death toll dropped from 3 billion to 1 billion, then to 500 million, then to 100 million. When the Council fleet finally arrived and drove off the Devourers with overwhelming force, only 70 million Karathi had died. It was still a catastrophe, but 2,930,000,000 souls had been saved because 7 human ships had decided that a distress call meant something. The Indomitable drifted in space, a broken shell leaking atmosphere and debris. Rescue teams found Captain Chen and 70% of her crew alive in sealed compartments, singing songs to keep their spirits up while they waited for help. High Chancellor Morvex visited her in the medical bay where she was recovering. He had intended to thank her for her bravery, and perhaps gently explain why such reckless action was not how civilized species operated. Instead, he found himself speechless as Captain Chen, bandaged and exhausted, looked at him with genuine confusion. "Why does everyone seem so surprised?" she asked. "They needed help. We were there. What else were we supposed to do?" The prophecy reborn. The Karathi incident changed everything, though not immediately. The Galactic Council was an ancient institution, and ancient institutions did not shift their beliefs overnight. High Chancellor Morvex ordered a comprehensive review of human activity since their emergence into galactic space. He assigned Ambassador Thren to lead the investigation, knowing her prior reports had suggested complexity, where others saw only danger. What Thren discovered over the following months painted a picture that contradicted almost every assumption the Council had made. Yes, Humans established colonies with aggressive speed, but they also sent medical teams to plague-stricken worlds that other species had quarantined and forgotten. Yes, their ships carried weapons, but those same ships had towed damaged alien vessels to safety, asking nothing in return. Yes, their history was soaked in blood, but that same history showed a species capable of learning, changing, and growing beyond its violent origins. Thren compiled incident after incident. A human freighter captain who had bankrupted herself buying medical supplies for a Talveri refugee camp. Human engineers who had spent 6 months repairing the water purification systems on a dying colony world, refusing payment because the inhabitants had nothing to give. Human children who sent handmade gifts to alien pen pals they would never meet, simply because they wanted to make friends across the stars. The evidence was overwhelming, but it raised more questions than it answered. How could the prophecy be so wrong? The Codex of Eternal Warnings had predicted hundreds of events with disturbing accuracy over the millennia. Empires had risen and fallen exactly as foretold. Technologies had emerged precisely when the ancient texts suggested they would. The prophecy about the Fire Children had described humanity's violence with perfect precision, but it had missed something essential about human nature. Or had it? Thren returned to the archive and read the prophecy again. She read it in its original language, without the translation filters that made ancient concepts fit modern understanding. She spent days studying the context, the linguistic patterns, the cultural framework of the civilization that had written it, and finally she understood. The prophecy hadn't been wrong. The translation had been incomplete. The word they had translated as destroy had multiple meanings in the ancient language. It could mean to obliterate, but it could also mean to transform through fire. The phrase, unmake what the ancients built, didn't necessarily mean destruction. It could mean dismantling old systems, breaking apart rigid structures that had calcified over millennia. The prophecy wasn't a warning about humanity. It was a warning to the galaxy about what humanity would force them to confront: their own stagnation, their own comfort with the status quo, their willingness to let millions die because the mathematics said they couldn't be saved. Thren presented her findings to the council. The reaction was predictably mixed. Some dismissed her interpretation as wishful thinking. Others accused her of trying to justify humanity's chaotic nature. But High Chancellor Morvex listened carefully. He was old enough to remember when the council had been younger, more dynamic, more willing to take risks for the greater good. He was old enough to remember when they had been more like humans. The real test came 6 months after the Karathi incident. A plague struck the Netheri worlds. A biological weapon unleashed by a terrorist faction that believed the council had grown too soft. The disease was virulent and targeted multiple species simultaneously. The council's response was measured, careful and painfully slow. Quarantine protocols were established. Research committees were formed. Every action went through proper channels and followed established procedures. Meanwhile, millions were dying. The human response was characteristically chaotic. They didn't wait for council approval or form committees. Scientists from a dozen human institutions collaborated in real time, sharing data across open networks where anyone could contribute. They tested treatments with a speed that violated every council safety protocol. Some of those treatments failed catastrophically, but 3 of them worked, and they worked fast enough to save billions of lives. The council censured the humans for their reckless disregard of proper research methodology. But privately, many council members began to wonder if proper methodology was worth the cost in lives. More incidents followed. Each one chipped away at the certainty the council had held for millennia. Humans didn't just break rules. They questioned why the rules existed in the first place. They challenged assumptions that had stood unchallenged for thousands of years. They asked uncomfortable questions about why some species received more resources than others, why certain trade routes favored established powers, why the council seemed more interested in maintaining order than pursuing justice. They were, in short, exactly the kind of disruptive force the prophecy had warned about. Ambassador Thren watched as younger species began emulating human behavior. The Karathi, grateful for their rescue, started questioning their own passive acceptance of council dictates. The Talveri refugees formed advocacy groups demanding better treatment, inspired by human activists who showed them how to organize and protest. Even some of the Council's oldest member species began internal debates about reform. The galaxy was changing. The old order was indeed being unmade, not through violence but through the simple human insistence that things could be better. 5 years after humanity reached the stars, High Chancellor Morvex called Ambassador Thren to his private chambers. He was near the end of his final term, ready to retire after centuries of service. He looked tired but strangely content. "I've been reading Earth's history," he told her. "Did you know they have a saying? The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I find that fascinating. They believe things improve given enough time and effort. Most species see the universe as static, unchanging in its fundamental nature. But humans see it as something that can be shaped, improved, made better." Thren nodded. "They're dangerously optimistic, Chancellor. They believe problems can be solved rather than simply managed." Morvex smiled, an expression that didn't come naturally to his species. "The prophecy was right, you know. Humanity is unmaking what the ancients built, our comfortable, stable, stagnant civilization. They're forcing us to remember what we forgot somewhere along the way. That survival isn't enough. That order without justice is just another form of tyranny. That sometimes the mathematics don't matter as much as the choice to try anyway." He pulled up a holographic display showing the Codex of Eternal Warnings. The prophecy about the Fire Children glowed in the air between them. "I've authorized a new translation," he said. "A more complete one. Would you like to see it?" The new text appeared beneath the old, where it once read, "And so the Fire Children shall unmake what the ancients built, and the galaxy shall know darkness once more." It now continued with lines that had been overlooked, considered poetic flourish rather than essential meaning. "But from that darkness shall come new light. From destruction, rebirth. The Fire Children will burn away the rot that has grown in comfortable shadows. They will forge new paths where old roads have crumbled, and though the galaxy will fear them, it will need them more than it knows. For stagnant waters eventually poison themselves, and only the storm can make them flow again." Thren felt her breathing pause. "How did we miss that?" "We saw what we expected to see," Morvex said quietly. "We read prophecy of fire and destruction and assumed it meant the end. We forgot that fire also cleanses. That destruction makes way for new growth. That sometimes the universe doesn't need order and stability. Sometimes it needs chaos and passion and stubborn refusal to accept that things can't be better." He closed the display and looked at her directly. "The Council will change, Ambassador. Perhaps not quickly enough for the humans, but it will change. Because they're showing us that it can, that it must. And someday, centuries from now, the galaxy will look back and realize that humanity's greatest gift wasn't their technology or their courage. It was their absolute refusal to accept that fate was written in stone." 10 years after humanity reached the stars, the Galactic Council underwent its first major reform in 4,000 years. New species were granted voting rights. Trade agreements were restructured to favor development over exploitation. Military protocols were revised to prioritize protection over control. The changes were slow, frustrating, and incomplete, but they were changes. Real changes. The kind that only happened when someone refused to accept the way things had always been. Ambassador Thren, now promoted to the Council itself, often thought about that ancient prophecy. The galaxy's prophets had declared humanity's arrival would bring darkness and destruction. In a way, they had been right. Humanity had destroyed the comfortable illusion that the old ways were the only ways. They had brought darkness to shadows where uncomfortable truths had hidden for millennia. But they had also brought light. The fierce burning light of people who believed that tomorrow could be better than today, who looked at impossible odds and decided to try anyway, who heard a distress call from strangers and answered without hesitation. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but not in the way anyone expected. Humanity hadn't unmade the galaxy. They had simply reminded it of what it had forgotten, that fate was never written in stone, that prophecies were warnings, not certainties, that the future belonged to those brave enough to forge it themselves, regardless of what ancient wisdom said was possible. And across 1,000 worlds, other species looked at their human neighbors with new understanding. They were loud, chaotic, emotional, and stubbornly idealistic. They made mistakes constantly. They rushed in where wiser beings feared to tread. But when the darkness came, when the mathematics said all was lost, when ancient prophecies declared defeat inevitable, humans had a special gift. They looked at fate, shrugged, and said one simple word that changed everything: no.